When people saw this man walking with 6 German Shepherds off leash, they were amazed by the blind obedience the dogs displayed. Some even thought that the man was abusing the dogs for submission. But when they finally discovered his secret, they were shocked and astonished. The moment people saw Augusto de Oliveira on the streets, it was like a thunderclap. He was a man in his early 20s who had a large group of German Shepherds snugly nestled together from the very beginning. Everyone could see that the dogs were working as a unit, displaying incredible cohesion and discipline. This incredible display of strength coupled with total submission was breathtaking and naturally drew the eyes of many onlookers, leaving them with more questions than answers. Many people also owned dogs, but none of them had ever been able to train them as Augusto did with his pack of German Shepherds. Even other dog trainers and animal experts found it difficult to understand how these dogs could move in perfect harmony under such unusual conditions. When a spectator dared to approach the pack a little closer, they discovered something unbelievable and extraordinary. None of the German Shepherds were wearing a leash, yet they all moved as if they were connected. It was as if they were invisibly linked together. Each dog knew its place and lined up at the command of Augusto's voice. The dogs displayed the precision of a military unit. There were never any scuffles where one tried to assert dominance over another dog. None of the German Shepherds paid attention to other dogs passing by. They completely disregarded the barking of other dogs behind fences or on their owners' leashes. They were fixated solely on their pack and their leader and nothing else. People would stare at Augusto and his dogs as they strolled through the streets and parks of Hyannis on their daily walks. Some were so impressed that they wanted to witness this peculiar behavior and often asked to take a photo. With a single command, Augusto could make the dogs come to an abrupt halt and pose for a photo. Once the fans were content, Augusto would give a whistle and the dogs would fall back into line, each maintaining their position behind his legs. In a short amount of time, this young man with his pack became the town's topic of conversation. Whispering behind held hands became the standard, and this gossip soon led to the assumption that something much more eerie was occurring. Some neighbors and spectators were indeed quite wary of this man who only kept company with his dogs. In society, Augusto was socially inept. Only a few individuals visited his residence, and he appeared to abstain from human gatherings. Self-appointed investigators spent hours stationed outside his apartment, peering through windows and straining to catch any clue that might elucidate how such a mild-mannered man commanded the obedience of all these untamed dogs. They suspected he subjected them to mistreatment to render them compliant, and a few even rummaged through his garbage bins in an attempt to expose him. One such neighbor was an inquisitive lady who had dedicated her life to rescuing stray animals. She was convinced that Augusto utilized electric shock collars to enforce obedience in his dogs. This woman canvassed the neighborhood, rallying support for a petition entreating authorities to probe into this purportedly abusive dog owner. Augusto could have likely dispelled doubts if he had elucidated his training techniques clearly, but whenever the topic was broached, he remained reticent. Unbeknownst to him, this reluctance to divulge contributed to the suspicions, which at best intimated that it had demanded a great deal of dedication and patience to refine his methods to the point where he could lead his dogs without a leash in public. Everyone knew this to be the case. It was no clandestine fact that he had devoted his life to becoming a proficient dog trainer. Augusto had been raised with German Shepherds, a herding breed distinguished for their bravery and loyalty. They possessed a marked inclination to safeguard and hesitated not in staking their lives to protect their loved ones. Everyone could perceive that this pack of dogs would defend Augusto with their lives. However, this unwavering loyalty eventually became the characteristic that led the police to investigate the sophisticated complaint of potential animal mistreatment. Some couldn't believe that these dogs were obedient solely out of respect for Augusto. They suspected he might have employed dark methods of torture. Despite living his life in Massachusetts, Augusto's upbringing took place in Brazil. As a youngster, he was surrounded by German Shepherds and immediately displayed a keen interest in animal behavior. Augusto spent countless hours among the dogs on a Brazilian farm. Serendipitously, he discovered he possessed the innate ability to influence their conduct. When law enforcement entered his residence, they were taken aback by what they witnessed. Augusto and his dogs embraced an uncommon and distinctive way of life. There were no traces of dog enclosures or pens where Griffin, Harmony, Jenna, Priscilla, Hannah, and Savannah slumbered. Instead, the dogs all shared a bed with Augusto. It was unmistakable that the dogs lived without any constraints. The police sought the assistance of animal experts who meticulously observed Augusto for several days. They closely monitored each of his actions and conducted a thorough search of the apartment. After a few days, they presented their findings. The encouraging news was that the police couldn't detect any signs of negligence or mistreatment of the German Shepherds. Quite the opposite, these were creatures living in a canine paradise. Both the police force and the Animal Rescue Service commended the vigilant citizens who advocated for the well-being of these at-risk dogs. This incident had ultimately been a complete misunderstanding. Augusto's dogs were treated with the utmost care. They were provided with top-tier nutrition and the best of attention, and their owner cherished them as if they were his own children, even though he felt indignation towards those who held him in such low regard. After the investigation, he managed to turn his passion into a profitable career. Augusto poured significant effort into training other dogs. Consequently, he instilled discipline and obedience in numerous dogs towards their owners. Many dog guardians entrusted their puppies to him, receiving well-mannered, fully trained dogs in a matter of weeks, easily adaptable to confined living spaces or other surroundings. Although he worked with all breeds, German Shepherds were his area of expertise. This gifted man did have his confidential techniques for training, yet he was open to sharing them. He stressed that a dog could only perceive him as part of the pack, and this connection could only be forged through extensive shared time. This involved personally feeding his dogs twice a day and sharing his sleeping space with them in his room. The rigorous training regimen urged the dogs to acknowledge his leadership. When the dogs became adept in understanding the owner's body language and commands, viewing him as the pack leader, it resulted in the kind of harmony and discipline witnessed during their walks. Gusto didn't just lead his own 6 German Shepherds unleashed through the streets. He also asserted his ability to lead up to 15 unleashed dogs simultaneously without any incidents. Recently, he even dared to navigate the streets of Boston, where his dog exhibited extreme discipline despite the heightened noise levels in a completely different environment. His techniques have garnered him an exceptional reputation and catapulted him into internet stardom when one of his videos went viral in 2013.